You're live with BBC News. Now, of course, there is more reporting on all our top stories on our BBC News and website and app. But let's first look at a test firing of a Trident missile from a Royal Navy submarine that failed. And for the second time in a row, the Ministry of Defence has insisted that the system used to carry Britain's nuclear warheads remains safe, secure and effective. Our correspondent Louisa Pilbeam joins me now from outside the Ministry of Defence in Westminster. Louisa, what more can you tell us about the failed test?
Well, this is a concerning incident and it's embarrassing for the Ministry of Defence and for the UK government here. And that's because this is the nuclear capability of the UK. It's the most powerful weaponry that the country has. It's last line of defence in order to protect itself. And things haven't gone well in terms of these tests. Now, what we know is that this test was carried out at the end of last month on the east coast of the US. And a Royal Navy submarine launched a missile, a nuclear missile that was unarmed for this test. And this was meant to be launched into the middle of the Atlantic in between Brazil and the west coast of Africa. But it actually ended up going into the sea right by the Royal Navy submarine. So a complete disaster in terms of that test, but the Ministry of Defence here, I have spoken to them this morning and they have said to me that this was an anomaly, as they're calling it, in terms of the test. They're basically saying that if this was in a real situation, this wouldn't have happened. As their term they are using, they say that it was event specific. They say that there are no implications for the reliability of the wider Trident missile system. And the Trident system is the UK's nuclear missiles, those submarines that are dotted around in secret locations around the world. And as you mentioned, it is the second time that this has happened. The first missile went off course. That was also unarmed, as they are in these situations. But it is embarrassing because it's the way that the UK's defence is portrayed to the world. But as I say, the Ministry of Defence, they're saying that this was a test that meant that it is only in terms of it's not a real situation, basically. They're saying that this was a specific incident that happened within this test environment and that we shouldn't be worried in terms of the UK for our safety.
All right, Louisa, thank you for that update. Well, let's take a closer look at all of this with Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, a former British Army colonel and a chemical and nuclear weapons expert. He's also the director for Doctor Under Fire. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, I hope you were able to hear my colleague Louisa there, and she used the word embarrassing several times. I'd love to get your perspective. Is this just embarrassing, or is it also a real national security concern?
Well, it's certainly embarrassing. This sort of information should never be in the public domain. And no doubt the Ministry of Defence will be looking at how it leaked out. And also, you know, the journalists who published the story need to think about whether it was, you know, in the best interests of this country. Because nuclear deterrence is all about perception. And if Putin now believes that the British nuclear deterrent doesn't work, then that will guide his thinking. I also find it rather strange that the person responsible for the defence of Britain, the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps, was at the bottom of the ocean for a few days fairly recently when, you know, the threat of war with Russia has never been higher and the Middle East is about to explode. But when it comes to the reliability of Trident, it is an old weapon, 30 years old. It's due to be replaced fairly soon. But probably as politicians and others can't comment, when you fire inert missiles and inert weapons, there are always intrinsic problems that you never get with the real thing. And when you consider a Vanguard submarine has 16 Trident nuclear missiles on it, you know, each one probably has a warhead with about 100 kilotons, which would flatten Moscow. Actually, this is an embarrassment rather than really any detriment to the defence of this country. But it also sort of underwrites as well. We've heard a lot about, you know, the beleaguered British Army and the Ministry of Defence short of funding. It really underwrites that with the threat so high at the moment that you've clearly described in the Middle East, and we know what's happening in Ukraine, that it's absolutely essential that our defence is up to defending this country. And the nuclear part of it is key to that.
Well, to that exact point, because you could argue that that is very much in the public interest, isn't it? And a Commons Defence Committee did raise questions about the budget cuts that you're talking about. So in your view, what is the state right now when it comes to the state of the UK armed forces and the defence capabilities we have? Is this indicative of a bigger problem here?
Well, it is potentially. I think people should be reassured that I believe our nuclear deterrent is absolutely as it should be. And, with the threats of Russia of nuclear attack, it's key that it is. When it looks at the wider defence, absolutely, this is something that, the political parties really need to consider. When you consider the Russian army has lost 350,000 soldiers dead in the last 2 years, that is 5 times the size of the current British army. And when we look forward to other capabilities, we know that the Navy have had a few issues with some of their ships, and we have got very few fighter aircraft squadrons that we did at the height of the Cold War. And if one accepts, as I do, that the threats are higher now than they were in the Cold War, we really need to make sure our defence is up to it. Chief of the General Staff, Patrick Sanders, who's leaving shortly, has absolutely underwritten these issues. The previous Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, who really knows about these things, also has stated we need to reevaluate, re-equip, and make sure that we are spending enough on the deterrence of this country, not just the nuclear, but also our conventional deterrence, to make sure that people like Putin don't head any further west than Ukraine.
Right, all right. Mr. de Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for your time and your expertise on this. And ministers are expected to make a statement about what happened in the House of Commons later today.